ballroom fell silent. Then her passionate piano masterpiece changed the Duke's heart forever. The tuning fork was still ringing when the coordinator grabbed Ilara Voss by the arm and told her the evening was about to fall apart. She had been at the piano for 40 minutes. Not playing it, tuning it. That was what she was paid for. 2 shillings and 6pence, a cold carriage ride across London, and the specific, quiet indignity of entering Ashmore Hall through the servants' entrance, while the guests swept in through the front in silk and pearls. She had learned not to think about that. It was a useful skill, not thinking about certain things. The grand piano sat at the far end of the ballroom, beneath 3 chandeliers that together held more candles than Ilara's entire building in Camden had ever seen at once. She had stopped counting after the first chandelier. It felt like something dangerous, counting beautiful things you could not keep. She tightened the last string, struck the key, listened. Perfect. She began packing her tools into their worn leather case. That was when the coordinator found her. His name was Mr. Holt. He was a short man with the permanently startled expression of someone who had spent 20 years organizing elegant events and still expected each one to destroy him personally. Tonight, it seemed, he was going to be right. "The accompanist," he said, breathing too fast, "is not coming." Ilara looked at him. Not coming as in delayed, or not coming as in the evening has a problem. "The second one, he is ill. His message arrived 10 minutes ago. The soprano is already here. The guests are already seated. The Duke is already on the stairs." She closed her case. "That is not my problem, Mr. Holt. You play. I tune. You were playing when I walked in 20 minutes ago." She had been. She had sat down for 60 seconds, just to confirm the tone was right across all registers. She had played 8 bars of something she had written herself, 7 years ago, in a room that was very cold and very quiet. She had not meant for anyone to hear it. "I was testing the instrument," she said. "Miss Voss." He put his hand on the edge of the piano, not quite touching her arm, the closest a man like Mr. Holt could come to desperation without losing all dignity. "The Duke will be in this room in 4 minutes. There are 230 guests. The program lists a piano performance as the first event of the evening. If there is no performance, the entire schedule collapses. The soprano cannot perform without accompaniment, and I will need to explain to the Duke of Ashmore why his winter gala has become an expensive gathering of people staring at each other." Ilara looked at the piano. It was a Steinway. She had tuned it, and it was magnificent now. And she had not played a Steinway in 2 years. The last time had been in a drafty church in Islington, accompanying a children's choir at Christmas for 4 shillings and a cold cup of tea. Before that, she had played in a concert hall, once, just once, with her father in the audience, and then he had died 3 months later, and the concert hall had not invited her back, and she had understood, without anyone saying it, that the door had closed. She kept her hand on the top of her leather case. "How much?" she said. Mr. Holt told her. She said nothing. He doubled it, which was its own kind of answer. She still said nothing. He went higher, and the number he said was the same as 6 months of rent on her studio in Camden, and she felt something inside her go very still and very clear. It was not the money, it was something else. She had not let herself think about the piano the way she used to. It was too expensive a thing to want, and too painful to keep wanting, when wanting it led nowhere. But she had tuned this piano, and she had played 8 bars, and the sound had come up through the keys and into her hands and her chest. And she had sat there for a moment thinking, "Yes, that is the sound. That is exactly the sound." She said, "I will need 5 minutes." Mr. Holt exhaled so sharply it was almost a sound effect. She did not change her clothes. She was wearing a plain gray dress, the good one she wore for professional appointments, sensible and undecorated, and nothing at all like what the women in the ballroom were wearing. She looked at herself in the small mirror beside the tuning cabinet and thought, "That'll do nicely as a disaster." Then she smoothed her hair, picked up nothing, and walked into the ballroom. The room was already full. The chandeliers threw warm gold light across 230 people in their finest clothes, and the buzz of conversation was low and pleasant, and utterly indifferent to her. She walked the length of the room without looking at anyone, keeping her eyes on the piano, and she felt the distance between the servants' corridor door and the piano bench, as if she were crossing something much wider than a ballroom floor. She sat down. She put her hands in her lap, not on the keys, just in her lap. The room did not notice her yet. She could hear Mr. Holt somewhere behind her, making a quiet announcement to the nearest guests, the word spreading outward in small ripples. She heard it reach the edge of the room. The conversation dropped in volume, then dropped again. Then, she heard footsteps on the marble staircase, measured, unhurried, the kind of footsteps that did not rush because they had never had to. She did not turn around. She would not turn around. The room went quiet. The Duke of Ashmore, she had never seen him, only heard the name the way everyone in London heard it, attached to things like the Ashmore estate and the Ashmore endowment, and once whispered, the poor Ashmore Duchess, only 2 years married, crossed to his seat at the front and sat down. Lara felt his presence the way you feel weather, not by looking at it, but by the way the air changes. She placed her hands on the keys. She thought, I could play the Chopin, the Nocturne in E-flat. It was safe and lovely, and no one would think twice. She knew it perfectly. Her fingers knew it in the dark. Her hands did not move toward the Chopin. They moved toward something else. She did not decide to play her own piece. Her hands simply went there, the way water goes downhill, the way a person's eyes go to a door they have been trying not to look at. The opening bars came out under her fingers, low and searching, and she heard the sound fill the room and she thought, this is a very large mistake. And then she stopped thinking entirely. The piece had no title. She had written it at 19, 3 days after her father's funeral, sitting at the small upright piano in their flat in Camden, still wearing her black dress. She had not been trying to write anything. She had sat down because she did not know what else to do with her hands, and what had come out was something she had never been able to describe to anyone. It was not sad exactly, though it was sad. It was the specific feeling of a room where someone used to be, the shape of the missing, the air where a person had been. She had played it twice that night and never performed it for anyone. She played it now for 230 strangers and one duke who had lost his own person, though she did not know that yet. The ballroom was absolutely silent by the second bar. Not the polite silence of audiences waiting to applaud, the other kind. The kind that happens when a room full of people all stop, at the same moment, because something has reached into them and put its hand around something they carry quietly and do not talk about. She played. The candle nearest the piano was the only thing she watched. She let it be the only thing in the world. It burned straight and steady in the warm air of the ballroom, and she played to it, and the music moved through the room, and the room held its breath, and she did not look at anyone. She did not look at the man in the front seat. She did not look at the Duke. She finished. The last note stayed in the room longer than it should have. It lived in the ceiling, in the curtains, in the spaces between people. And then it was gone, and the room stayed silent for one more beat, one long, strange, necessary beat, and then the applause came. It was not the polite kind either. Alara took her hands off the keys. She looked at the candle. It was still burning. She stood, turned, nodded once to the room without quite meeting any eyes, and walked directly toward the servants' corridor. She was almost at the door when she realized her hands were shaking. She pressed them together and kept walking. She did not see the Duke stand up. She did not hear the thing he said quietly to the man beside him, which was not a compliment, which was not social conversation, which was something else entirely. 3 words spoken in a low voice that the man beside him would remember for years. She did not know any of that yet. She knew the servants' corridor, and the cold air of it, and the sound of the ballroom applause fading behind the heavy door, and the tuning fork in the pocket of her coat that she had forgotten to put back in her case and that she turned over and over in her fingers now, feeling its weight, listening to the faint ring it made every time it touched the metal button of her pocket. It was still ringing when the footman found her. The envelope was thick, the card inside was small, and the handwriting on it was abbreviated, almost impatient, the writing of a person who found words expensive and used them accordingly. She read it once in the dim light of the corridor. She read it twice. Outside, through the closed door, she could hear the evening resuming. She could hear voices and movement, and the first notes of the soprano beginning her program. The gala was saved. Mr. Holt would not have to explain anything to anyone. Everything was continuing as planned. Alara Voss stood in the servants' corridor of Ashmore Hall, with a card in one hand and a tuning fork in the other, and she did not go back in, and she did not leave either, for a long moment. The card said, "Who taught you to write like that?" Not a compliment, a question, and not a gentle one. She found a receipt in the left pocket of her coat, the one from the apothecary on Thursday, 6 pence for headache powder. She turned it over. She pressed it against the wall. She wrote 4 words in the margin, in her neat small hand, the one her father had called her professional handwriting, as opposed to her thinking handwriting, which he had called a catastrophe. She wrote, "No one. That is the problem." She folded the receipt once. She gave it to the footman. She watched him carry it back through the door into the bright, golden, impossible room on the other side. Then she put on her coat, picked up her leather case, and walked out into the cold London night. She turned the tuning fork over in her fingers the whole way home. 3 days passed, and Alara tried to forget about the card. She was mostly unsuccessful. Her studio in Camden was small and practical, and honest in the way that small practical rooms are honest, meaning it told the truth about itself without decoration. There was the upright piano against the far wall, dark wood and aging ivory keys that she kept in better condition than anything else she owned. There was the work table where she composed, covered in manuscript paper and pencils, and the particular organized chaos of a working musician who knew exactly where everything was and could prove it if challenged. There was the narrow window that looked out onto the street, and the street was rarely interesting, and she found herself looking out of it more often than usual in those 3 days. She taught 2 students on Monday, a boy of 12 named Alfred, who had genuine talent and no patience, and a woman of 40 called Mrs. Patton, who had no talent and enormous patience, and who would, Alara suspected, outlast both of them through sheer determination. She corrected Alfred's fingering for the 4th week in a row, and told him that the piano did not care how fast he wanted to go, and Alfred pulled the face that 12-year-old boys pull when adults say true things. She told Mrs. Patton that her scales were improving, which was true, and that she would be playing full pieces by spring, which was optimistic but not dishonest. On Tuesday, she accepted a commission to tune 3 instruments at a school in Kensington. The work was straightforward and paid her the week's rent, and she did it without thinking about anything except the instruments. On Wednesday, she did not go out. She sat at the work table and looked at manuscript paper and did not write anything. She made tea. She drank it too hot and burned the tip of her tongue, and spent the rest of the morning with the faint ghost of that small pain, reminding her she was paying insufficient attention to what was directly in front of her. What was directly in front of her was a blank page. What was also in front of her was the question on a small card from a man she had never met. Who taught you to write like that? She had written music since she was 8 years old. Her father, Paul Voss, who had come from Berlin with a cello, a dictionary, and no money, had taught her to read music before she could reliably read English. He had believed in her talent the way some parents believe in a child's talent, which is to say with slightly more confidence than the evidence warranted and completely without reservation, and she had loved him for it even when she thought he was wrong. She had studied formally for 2 years at a conservatory in Holborn before the fees became impossible. She had learned the rest by doing it. No one had taught her to write the way she wrote. She had not known it showed. On Thursday morning she received a second card from Ashmore Hall. This one was longer, 5 sentences instead of 2. It informed her, in the same abbreviated, slightly impatient handwriting, that the Duke required a memorial composition, for piano, to be performed at a private concert in 3 months, in memory of the late Duchess, who had cared greatly for music. The fee was named in the 4th sentence. It was substantial enough that Alara read the 4th sentence 3 times, to make sure she had understood it correctly. The 5th sentence said simply, "A response at your earliest convenience." She turned the card over. It was blank on the back. She turned it face up again. The late Duchess, she had heard that, whispered, at the back of her mind since she had first heard the name Ashmore. The poor Ashmore Duchess, only 2 years married. She did not know the details and had not tried to find them out, because the details were not her business, and other people's grief was a room she did not enter without invitation. She thought about the fee. She thought about the rent, the manuscript paper, Alfred's missed payment last month, which his mother had apologized for and promised to settle soon. She thought about the piano at Ashmore Hall, the Steinway, the sound it made when she had played those 8 bars, and felt the tone come up through the keys. She put on her coat and walked to a stationer's and bought a card. She wrote her acceptance in 7 sentences. She proposed that she would need 1 meeting with the Duke to understand the specific nature of what he wished the music to convey, as a memorial composition required more than technical specification. It required understanding what had been loved. She gave her studio address. She wrote her name at the bottom, Alara Voss, without title, because she had no title to give. She posted it at noon. On Friday evening, she heard a knock at her studio door. She was in the middle of a scale exercise, not performing, just warming her hands after the cold studio afternoon, and the knock was not the knock of Alfred or Mrs. Patton or the landlord. It was different, not louder exactly, but more deliberate, the knock of someone who had considered it before doing it. She crossed to the door and opened it. The man standing in the door of her Camden studio did not look like the kind of man who should be standing in the door of a Camden studio. He was tall, with dark hair going gray at the edges, and a face that had been organized by years of keeping things contained. He was wearing a coat that cost more than her piano, and he wore it the way people wear expensive things when they are used to them, which is to say without noticing. He was not young, he was not old. He was somewhere in the middle of his 30s, and he looked like someone who had spent the recent part of those years working very hard at something that was not work. He said, "Miss Voss." She said, "You did not wait for my response." "Your response took 3 days. I estimated it would be an acceptance." He paused. "I was correct. You could have been wrong." "I could have been," he said it calmly, without embarrassment. "May I come in?" It was not quite a question. She noticed that. She also noticed that he was not looking around the studio the way some people did when they entered a room they found smaller than expected, taking inventory of what was missing. He was looking at the piano. She stepped back and held the door open. He walked to the center of the room, which was not far, and stood there in his expensive coat, and she closed the door and stood across from him with the work table between them, and they looked at each other in the gray winter light coming through the narrow window. "Edmund Van Thorpe," he said, "though I expect you knew that. I expected it was you. Yes. You played something on the night of the gala that you had not played before, not publicly." "No. How long had you had it?" 9 years. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved through his face and was contained very quickly. She catalogued it without commenting on it, the way you catalogue the weather. "The Duchess," he said, "played the piano. Not at your level. She was not trained, but she played every morning. And she had a way of approaching music that was unlike performance. It was more like conversation. She spoke to it and it answered. I would like the memorial piece to feel like that." Elara thought about it. She thought about it seriously, not as a courtesy, as if someone is speaking and the piano is answering. "Yes." Or as if both are speaking at once. He looked at her. Something in the set of his face changed very slightly. "Yes," he said. "That." She pulled out the chair from the work table and sat down. She took a pencil and the top sheet of manuscript paper. She began writing notes, not music, just words, questions. She asked him what the Duchess had loved in music, what she had avoided, what time of day she had played, whether she had favored the low register or the high, whether she had played slowly or with urgency, whether she had played with the window open or closed. He answered every question. He answered them with more detail than she expected, and the detail was the specific kind that comes from someone who has paid attention, not for any purpose, simply because the person in front of them was the kind of person who made you pay attention. Donata, she wrote for 20 minutes. She did not sit down. He stood with his coat still on, and she did not offer him tea, and the absence of that small social courtesy sat between them, and she did not feel it was a problem, and neither, apparently, did he. At the end of the 20 minutes she had 2 pages of notes and several questions she had not asked, because they were not her questions to ask. She said, "I will have a first draft within 6 weeks. I will send word when it is ready for you to hear." "I would prefer to hear it here," he said. "Not at Ashmore Hall." She looked up from the manuscript paper. "At Ashmore Hall," he said carefully. "It would be a presentation. I do not want to hear it as a presentation." She understood what he meant. She thought he probably knew she understood. "Here then," she said. He nodded. He moved toward the door. He stopped, one hand on the frame, and said without turning around fully, "The piece you played at the gala." "Yes. You wrote it at a specific moment." It was not quite a question, the same way his knock had not quite been a question, the same way very little this man said was quite a question even when it was asking something. "Yes," she said. "I thought so." He did not say anything else. He went through the door, and she heard his footsteps on the stairs, and then she heard the street door close. She sat very still for a moment. Then she put the pencil down and looked at the 2 pages of notes. The light through the narrow window was fading into the gray London evening, and her studio was cold, and the upright piano waited against the wall with its imperfect keys and its excellent tuning. And she thought about a woman she had never met, who had played every morning in a room Elara would never see, speaking to the piano as if it would answer, which it would, which it always did, if you knew how to listen. She pulled a blank sheet of manuscript paper to the top of the stack. She did not write anything on it yet. She sat with it blank in front of her and let herself feel the specific weight of what had just been asked of her, which was not to write a beautiful piece of music, she could do that, but to write something true about a life she had not lived, given to her in 20 minutes of careful answers, by a man who had clearly loved someone very much and had no idea yet where to put that. She picked up the pencil. She held it over the page. She did not know what the first note would be yet. She would. The first draft was finished in 11 days, and Elara burned it the same evening. She sat beside the small iron stove in her studio, fed the manuscript pages in one by one, and watched them turn. It had been 11 days of work, real work, the kind that leaves you tired in a way that sleep does not fix. And it was correct in every technical sense. The key was right, the duration was right, the structure moved the way a good memorial piece should move, from gravity to something gentler, like light coming back into a room. It was well done. It was also completely wrong. She could feel the wrongness in it the same way you feel a slight mismatch in a tuned string. Not enough to make most people wince, just enough to make someone who listens carefully unable to stop noticing. The piece was beautiful the way a formal portrait is beautiful. It looked like what it was supposed to look like. It did not feel like anything. She fed the last page into the stove and watched it go. She had 2 pages of notes from her meeting with Edmund Vanthorpe. She read them again now by the light of the stove. She had written his answers in her small, neat handwriting, and a few of her own observations in the margins in the other handwriting, the one her father had called the catastrophe. One of the margin notes said, "He says she played with the window open even in winter." Another said, "Low register. She was not afraid of the low register." Another said, "Quickly, he says, but I think he means urgently. Those are different things." And at the bottom of the second page, so small she almost missed it, in handwriting, she did not remember writing, "He is still listening to her." She looked at that for a while. She had met him once, for less than an hour. She had asked professional questions, and he had given her professional answers, and they had been, by any standard, conducting business. But there is a thing that happens when someone answers questions about a person they have loved, a thing that has nothing to do with the words they use. The answers are present tense even when the grammar is past. He had answered every question about the Duchess as if she were still somewhere in the house, still playing every morning, still preferring the window open, still in conversation with the piano. He was still listening. Alara put the notes down and went to the piano. She did not play anything composed. She played, searched is a better word. She played the way she had at 19, before she had learned to edit herself, before she had understood that the music you write for yourself is a different instrument from the music you write for performance. She played slowly, and then faster, and she followed the sound wherever it went without judging it, and she played for 2 hours without stopping, and when she finally lifted her hands, the room was fully dark, and she had found something. Not a complete piece, a thread, a first note, and then the suggestion of a second note, and the shape of the space between them. That was enough to start. The second draft took 3 weeks. It was slower work and harder work and more honest work. She would write 6 bars and then leave them alone for a day and come back and listen to them with fresh ears and change 2 notes and leave them again. She was looking for the sound of a conversation between 2 voices that had learned each other so well they no longer needed to take turns. The sound of 2 things speaking simultaneously and listening simultaneously, and finding, in that overlap, something that was neither one of them alone. She had never written anything like it before. She played the completed draft at 3 in the morning, when Camden was fully silent, and the street outside her window held nothing but the occasional distant sound of a cart on cobblestones. She played it through twice without stopping. The second time, about 2/3 of the way through, she felt something happen in her chest that was not about the music she was playing, and not about the woman she was writing it for. She sat in the dark after and thought about that. She thought about it in the way you think about something that is true but inconvenient, not denying it, but not picking it up either, leaving it on the floor of your mind and walking around it carefully. She sent a card to Ashmore Hall the next morning. She said the draft was ready. She said she was available for the Duke to come and hear it, at any time that suited him. His reply came that afternoon, Friday, 2 o'clock. On Friday she taught Alfred in the morning, corrected his fingering for what she told him was the last time, and meant it, and was pleased to see that he believed her, which improved his technique noticeably in the remaining 30 minutes of the lesson. She sent him home with specific instructions, and let herself feel the small satisfaction of a teacher, on a day when teaching worked. She had tea. She tidied the work table without actually moving anything important. She looked at the manuscript pages on the piano stand and thought about moving them, and decided against it. They were part of the room, and the room was where they were going to be, and she was not going to perform this, she was going to play it. That distinction mattered to her. At 2:05 she heard the knock she already knew by now. Deliberate, considered, one knock of a man who did not do small things carelessly. He was wearing a dark coat again, but a different one, and his face had the same quality of containment that she remembered, though she thought, she was not certain, that there was slightly less of it than the first time, or perhaps the same amount. and she was simply more able to see it now that she knew what she was looking at. She said, "Sit, if you like." He sat in the chair she had placed at an angle to the piano, not directly in front of it. She had thought about that placement. Directly in front felt like an audience, which she did not want. At an angle, felt like being in the room with someone, which was closer to the truth of what she was trying to do. She did not explain the piece before she played it. There was nothing to explain. Either it would speak or it would not. She placed her hands on the keys. She played. It opened simply, a single melodic line in the low register, quiet and unhurried, the voice of something that was not rushing because it had learned that rushing was beside the point. It moved slowly through its first phrase, and then a second voice entered in the middle register, not interrupting the first but joining it, speaking at the same moment, and the two voices did not clash because they were listening to each other even as they spoke. This was the thing she had been trying to find. This was the thread she had followed for 3 weeks. Two voices in simultaneous conversation, each complete, neither canceling the other, the music between them, the thing that mattered most. She played through the middle section, where the second voice grew more searching, not distressed but reaching, the way you reach toward something when you are not certain it is still there. And the first voice steadied, stayed, answered without words, simply stayed. She played the final section, where both voices came back together, quieter now, the conversation closer, not resolved in the sense of having found an answer, but resolved in the sense of having found a way to continue. The last note. She lifted her hands. She looked at the metronome on the shelf beside the piano. It was not running. She had not wound it. She watched it anyway, its stationary needle, and she counted in her own head. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. She did not turn around. 6, 7. She heard something, not words, a sound. She turned then. He had his face in his hands. He was not making noise. He was entirely still, and his face was in his hands, and the room was very quiet. And Alara turned back to face the piano, because to continue looking was not something she was willing to do to him. She looked at the keys instead. She looked at the strings through the open lid. She listened to the room. She counted to 60. Then she said quietly, to the piano, "I will make changes if there are things that are wrong." It took him a moment. Then he said, behind her, his voice very steady, "There is nothing wrong." Then, "I will make changes, if there are things that could be more true." A longer pause. "No." She nodded at the piano. "She would have." He started, stopped. She waited. "She would have sat next to you," he said finally, "while you played that. She would not have been able to sit anywhere else." Alara thought about a woman she had never met, sitting beside her at this piano, with the window open even in winter. She said, "That is the highest thing anyone has ever said to me about my music." She meant it. She felt him understand that she meant it. They sat in the quiet of the studio for a while after that, not speaking, and it was the most natural silence Alara had sat in for a long time. Not the silence of two people with nothing to say. The silence of two people who have just said something real, and are allowing it to be real without covering it over immediately with other words. After a time he said, "How did you know?" "The notes from our meeting. I did not tell you that much. You told me she played with the window open in winter. You told me she was not afraid of the low register. You told me she played urgently, not quickly." Alara paused. "And you answered every question I asked about her in the present tense." Silence again. "Different now." "I did not notice that," he said. "I know." He stood, eventually. She heard the chair and his footsteps, and she remained at the piano with her hands in her lap, the way she had sat on the night of the gala before she began. He stopped near the door. "The concert is in 6 weeks," he said. "Yes. I would like you to play it yourself, not a hired performer." She had not expected that. "I am a hired performer." "No," he said. "You are not. Not for this one." She turned to look at him then. He was standing near the door in his dark coat and his face was fully composed again, all the containment back in place, but she knew now what it cost to maintain it, and she found that she respected the cost more than she had expected to. "All right," she said. He nodded. He went through the door. She heard his steps on the stairs, slower going down than they had been the first time, or perhaps she was simply listening more carefully, and then the street door, and then Camden in the afternoon. She looked at the metronome. She reached out and wound it and set it going. The needle began its steady arc, left and right, marking time the same as it always had, indifferent to what had just happened in this room. She watched it for a long moment. Then she picked up a pencil, pulled a fresh manuscript page to the top of the stack, and began writing. Not changes to the memorial piece. Something new. The first bars of something she did not have a name for yet. She played it back once when it was 6 bars long. She stopped. She wrote the 7th bar. The concert was held on a Saturday in late February, when London was caught between the end of winter and the reluctant beginning of something warmer, and the sky above Ashmore Hall had the particular pale brightness of a day that cannot quite decide if it is cold. Ilara arrived at the servants' entrance by habit, then stopped with her hand on the iron rail and reconsidered. She went around to the front. The doorman looked at her plain coat and her leather case and made the particular assessment that doormen make, which is based on clothing and confidence and the way a person stands. And Ilara had been standing in rooms where she did not belong since she was old enough to understand the difference, so she stood in a way that required no discussion, and the doorman held the door. The hall was already being prepared. The South morning guests were not arriving until 7, but the household staff moved through their work with the organized quiet of a machine that had been run many times before. She recognized Mr. Holt across the room, checking something on a list, and he looked up, saw her, and produced the expression of a man who is profoundly relieved that a previous disaster had not repeated itself. He came over. "Miss Voss, everything is in order. The piano has been tuned. I used your recommended man from Kensington, exactly as you asked. The program is printed. Your name is 3rd on the program." Her name on the program. She thought about that later, the specific small weight of it. "Thank you," she said. She asked to have an hour alone with the piano before the staff resumed their work in the ballroom. Holt agreed without hesitation. She had apparently earned a degree of professional authority in his mind that she had not possessed 3 months ago, when she had arrived through the back door with her tools. She went to the piano. She sat down and placed her hands in her lap and looked at the keys for a moment. Oh, same piano, different light. Morning instead of evening. Pale and honest instead of candlelight's generous gold. It showed things differently. She could see the age on the piano's casing, the slight wear at the edges of the keys that spoke of a long life and many hands. She played the memorial piece through once, slowly, not as a rehearsal, but as a conversation with the room. She was telling the piano what was going to happen tonight and listening to hear if the room agreed.
The room agreed.
The sound came up through the keys and into her hands and her chest and filled the ballroom. And in the empty ballroom it was larger than she expected and more present, and she thought,
"Yes.
This room can hold this music. This music can hold this room." She played one other thing. The piece she had written at 19, in the cold room, in the black dress. She had not planned to play it. Her hands went there, the way they had on the night of the gala. The way water goes downhill. She played it through to the end, and sat with the last note, and thought about her father, which she could do now without the grief taking the floor away from under her, which had not always been true. She closed the piano lid and went to find somewhere to sit quietly until the evening. She found the library on the 2nd floor, which had the kind of silence that old books create, a productive quiet, a room that had absorbed a great deal of thinking and had room for more. She sat in a chair by the window and looked at the pale February sky, and thought about nothing in particular, and everything in general, which is its own kind of preparation. She heard the door. She did not look up immediately. "I thought you would be at the piano," said a voice she knew. She looked up then. He was in the doorway, not yet in the room, and he was not wearing his formal evening clothes yet, just a dark suit, and he looked like a person rather than a duke, which she suspected was why he had come up here before the guests arrived rather than staying in the rooms that required him to be one. "I said hello to it," she said. "We are ready for each other." He came into the room. He did not sit. He stood near the window, which was something she had noticed about him. He stood rather than sat in rooms he was uncertain about, and sat in rooms he had decided were safe, and she found it interesting that he sat in her studio and stood in his own library. "The program tonight has your name," he said. "Mr. Holt told me. Does that concern you?" She thought about it genuinely. 6 months ago it would have, she said. "I think I am past the point where I can decide to be concerned about things like that and have the concern be useful." He was quiet then. "The piece is extraordinary. You heard it in a Camden studio in the afternoon. Tonight the room will be full, and the chandelier will be lit, and it will be different. I know." A pause. "It will still be extraordinary." She looked at him. He was looking out of the window at the pale sky. There was something different about him today. Not looser exactly, but less like something held against pressure. The containment was still there, but it was not working as hard. She thought, he is beginning to allow himself to be somewhere other than where she was. She thought, that is the hardest thing there is. She said, because she had learned that this man valued directness, and found ornamentation a waste of both their time. It cost me something, writing that piece. I did not expect it to. He turned from the window. He looked at her. I wrote about something I had not felt in a long time, she said. Your questions, the ones my notes were answers to, they did something I was not prepared for. He waited. You paid attention to her, Alara said, the way you answered. You paid attention the way people do when they love something, not just what it is but what it prefers. The window open, the low register, urgently, not quickly. She paused. I had not been paid attention to like that, not since my father, and I was not expecting to recognize it. He was very still. I am telling you that, she said, because you were honest in my studio and it produced something real, and I think honesty is owed in return. He was quiet for long enough that she was certain she had said too much. She prepared herself for the professional distance, the careful re-establishment of appropriate space, the polite acknowledgement, and the return to the role of patron and hired composer. He said, I heard you. 2 words, but they were heavy with something they were not saying, and she heard the thing they were not saying, and she let it be said without saying it. They stood in the library, the pale February light between them, and said nothing more for a moment. The guests will arrive at 7, he said finally. Yes. You should eat something. The kitchen will give you whatever you need. I will. He went to the door. He stopped, which she had begun to expect. He always had one more thing at the door. It was, she was coming to understand, where he said the things he had not quite planned to say. After the concert, he said, I would like you to stay. She looked at him. Not for the social hour, he said. After that, I would like to talk. Not about the music. She thought about the tuning fork in her coat pocket, which she had brought tonight out of something she could not quite name, some private system of meaning that made no sense explained out loud. All right, she said. He nodded. He left. She sat in the library for a while longer, in the good productive silence of old books, and then she went downstairs and ate something in the kitchen, and was kind to the cook who recognized her from 3 months ago and said, without ceremony, that she had liked the playing. The guests arrived. The evening assembled itself the way these evenings do, not all at once but in layers, conversation building on conversation, the chandelier doing its work of making everything golden and possible, the warm murmur of people gathered in a large room feeling the particular pleasure of being exactly where they are supposed to be. Alara stood at the edge of it again. Same gray dress, the good one, same straight back, same quiet inventory of the distance between where she stood and the piano. Different though, too. Her name was on the program. She had been through that piano's range in the pale morning light and told it what was coming. She was not the accidental musician tonight, pressed into service by someone else's emergency. She was the reason for this part of the evening. She walked to the piano when her turn came, and the room quieted, and she sat, and she placed her hands in her lap first. She did not look at the candle this time. She looked for him. He was in the second row. He had not taken the front. That small detail told her something. The choice of the second row. The refusal of the most prominent seat. She found his face in the warm light and held it for one moment, and then she placed her hands on the keys. She played. The memorial piece began its single melodic line in the low register, unhurried, not rushing. It moved through its first phrase, and then the second voice entered, and the 2 voices spoke simultaneously, listening and speaking at once, neither overwhelming the other. The room was quiet before the end of the second bar. She played through the middle section, the reaching, and then the steadying, and then the final section, where the voices came back together, quieter, closer, not finished but found. The last note. She did not lift her hands immediately. She let it live in the room the way the first note had lived, the one she had played 3 months ago that had started all of this. She let it breathe. Then she lifted her hands. The applause was immediate and sustained, and she heard, under it, something quieter. The particular quality of a room moved in the way that does not announce itself. She stood. She turned. She looked at the second row. His hands were on his knees. He was not applauding yet. He was looking at her with the expression of a man at the exact moment when something that has been held very tight begins, carefully, to open. Then he put his hands together. The evening continued. The social hour began. She moved through it at the edges which she was practiced at, accepting the compliments that came her way, with genuine thanks and a small smile. Mr. Holt found her at one point and said something that she thought might have been the most words he had ever voluntarily produced in sequence, all of them variations on magnificent. She thanked him. She waited. The guests left in the comfortable, gradual way of guests who have had a good evening and are not in a hurry to end it. The household began the quiet business of restoration. The chandeliers were dimmed, the room emptied. She was at the piano. She did not know when she had walked back to it. She was there, sitting on the bench, and her right hand had one finger resting on a single key, middle F, the one where the instrument crossed from one quality of sound to another, pressing it without enough force to sound it, just resting. The music that almost existed, the note just before it became something. She heard footsteps on the marble floor. Not Mr. Holt's, not the staff's. She knew this pace. He sat beside her on the piano bench. Not across from her, not in a chair placed at a thoughtful angle. Beside her, on the bench, close enough that she could feel the presence of him the way you feel the warmth of a fire before you see it. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "Play me the other one," he said. She did not ask which one. She played the piece she had written at 19, in the cold room, in the black dress. She played it the way she had played it that first night, at the gala, to the candle. Except that tonight she was not watching the candle. She was aware, with the whole side of her, of the man sitting beside her on the bench, and she let herself be aware of it, and she played. The piece moved through her hands and into the room that was nearly empty now, just them and the dimmed chandeliers and the quiet household sounds from elsewhere in the hall. It was smaller in the empty room, more honest, more itself. She played the last note. She kept her finger on the key until the sound had fully gone. His hand came to rest beside hers on the keys, not touching them, not playing anything. Just there, present, alongside. She turned her head and looked at him. He was looking at the piano. His face was entirely open. The containment was not gone. She did not think it would ever be entirely gone. It was too much a part of him. But the work it was doing had changed. It was no longer holding grief in. It was holding something else. Something that was just beginning to have a shape. "My father died when I was 19, she said. That piece is what I had left of the first week after. "I know," he said. Not as if someone had told him, as if he had heard it in the music, all those months ago, the night of the gala, when the ballroom fell silent in the second bar, and he had said 3 words to the man beside him that the man would remember for years. The words had been, "Who is she?" She did not know that yet. She would learn it much later, from that man, at a dinner she had not yet been invited to, in a life that was only just beginning to arrange itself differently from the one she had been living. She looked at the piano. His hand was beside hers, near the keys, not pressing any of them, the music that almost existed. "You said you wanted to talk," she said. "Not about the music." "Yes." "Then talk." And he did. The chandeliers dimmed lower over Ashmore Hall, and Camden was miles away, and the pale February night settled over London without urgency. And Elora Voss sat at the Steinway beside the Duke of Ashmore, and the story that had begun with a tuning fork and a card, and a question that was not quite a question, finally had somewhere to go. She did not turn the tuning fork over in her fingers on the way home. She did not go home for a long time.